This is the session which I suppose will answer the question posed by that FCC commissioner to Professor Coase. Is this all a big joke? It's about spectrum auctions. We have 3 papers. We're going to proceed the way the last session did, paper questions, and so forth. Each of the papers will have about a half an hour total, and I would ask the speakers to limit themselves to about 20 minutes so we can have time for questions. The first speaker is Charles Jackson from George Washington University, who's going to talk about the New Zealand spectrum system.
Well, I want to thank the organizers for putting this session today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these ideas, and my goal here is to explain how Professor Coase's article and ideas influenced the development of the spectrum rights scheme in New Zealand and somewhat in the United States also, and to give a feeling for the kinds of benefits that those ideas have generated and could have generated. In terms of where I'm going to go in this talk, I'll give some historical background on how the New Zealand spectrum reform process was developed, how the property rights were defined. Maybe I'll finish the third line in this slide sometime. How the New Zealand system compares to what we do in the United States, Professor Coase's influence, and how things could have been done better. Most of you are probably familiar with New Zealand. One of the great advantages from a spectrum policy point of view of New Zealand is it's not near anybody. And consequently, at frequencies above about 50 megahertz, what they do doesn't matter to the rest of the world in most parts of the band. Consequently, they have a degree of political freedom that other nations don't have. You know, in the United States, Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit share a common border, and the U.S. and Canada can't make independent decisions because the signals in one nation will spill over the border. I did a study once, I think Germany, there were something like 10 different countries within 100 kilometers of the German border. And you can see how New Zealand's situation is vastly different, makes it possible for them to make independent decisions. The way spectrum reform came about in New Zealand was that in 1984, the Labour gained a majority in Parliament. The economy was kind of stagnant, and so Labour turned out to be more or less Thatcherite. They did a variety of things in a number of industries, including telecommunications. The first thing they did in telecommunications was divide the post office into 3 enterprises, an FCC-like enterprise inside the government, a post office, and a phone company. And prior to that, the major spectrum user, the phone company operations of the post office, was also the spectrum regulator. And as you can see, that probably hampered development of competition in a variety of ways, that you could imagine. And a few years later, the government commissioned a report by an economist, I think at the University of Canterbury, called John Fountain, who surveyed the literature on the economic management of the radio spectrum. In mid-1988, the government granted a contract to NERA to recommend a system of property rights-based management for the radio spectrum. I was part of that team, so I'm familiar with how we worked. Near the end of '88, I think it was sometime in November, we delivered our final report, and in late 1989, I mean almost a little bit more than a year after we delivered our report, a statute was enacted. Now, the Fountain Report, here's a description of it. I think you can find it of the title of it. You can find it on the web. The first 2 papers mentioned in it, I believe, were the Coase papers, the 5960 paper, and Fountain didn't advocate the use of a property rights scheme, but I think any intelligent reader who read his report would see that there there was a strong theoretical argument that property rights in spectrum were doable and that they would serve efficiency. The NERA report, as I said, was delivered in late '88, and it described a regime for a new regulatory system in New Zealand. Primary emphasis was on property rights system. There was strong parallel to the Torrens title system. I must say, during the last session, I was listening and I kept thinking, gee, I'd love to revise my paper to make a better complement to follow what just went before. But as I say, there was a strong parallel to the Torrens system, which is used for the registration of titles in many Commonwealth countries. So the legal side of our proposals were directly paralleled on the land title system used in New Zealand and Australia. But the report also recommended retaining a licensing system, a licensing option, much as it's been done traditionally. There were a couple of arguments for retaining licensing, and one was you just need some mechanism to keep things working. You don't want to shut everything down for 2 years until you get the property rights scheme in place. And secondly, there are a wide variety of radio uses for which the licensing is quite efficient, or is forced on a nation by things like treaty obligations. You know, the thought that New Zealand could go its own way on aeronautical mobile radio is just crazy. I mean, if they did that, airplanes couldn't fly from California to New Zealand unless they bought extra radios, and who'd want to do that? So it makes lots of sense for New Zealand to harmonize its radio use in maritime distress communications or aviation, a lot of other areas with the world, and licensing is an appropriate tool for that. We also recommend an option for unlicensed use, what they now call in New Zealand spectrum parts, like we have in Part 15. It's used for things like cordless phones. There are a wide variety of radio applications for which either there's no interference externality that's worth worrying about. We've decided we'll take the advantages of being able to turn a radio on easily and without any coordination costs. Whereas New Zealand has a unicameral parliamentary system, so basically once the relevant committee or the cabinet has made a decision on what the policy is going to be, it's all downhill from there on. It's sort of like Chicago politics, I guess. The statute reflected most of our recommendations. There was a substantial fraction of the statute, something like a third to a half, was great expansion on the details of property rights. We didn't, as I recall, we didn't explicitly say that the property rights should be something that can be the security for a mortgage. But the statute did, and had rules about how that did. I think large part of that statute, those parts of the statute were lifted more or less wholesale from the real estate law. And so it wasn't a lot of work. There were also other things in there that we hadn't thought of, like if somebody owns a spectrum property and they've either given a license or some other kind of lease to somebody who's a tenant in it, they can't sell half of the tenancy to somebody. And it's like if somebody has leased you a building, they can't sell the living room to somebody and the bedroom to somebody else and leave you with two landlords. I mean, we hadn't thought of anything like that. So there are a lot of details of the rights that are taken from, I think, real estate practice that we hadn't considered, but that make it clear. There was also another feature that I think the engineering community within the New Zealand government got in there, which is that when a property owner enters into a sublease or subdivides their property, that the deed has to be reviewed by a radio engineer to see that it makes sense, and they have a process for certifying radio engineers. And I guess as an engineer, that sounds good to me. But it's something. And the statute also set a 20-year term on the duration of the property rights. Our report recommended indefinite or fee simple like duration, but it was kind of a wishy-washy recommendation, and it said, if the government's concerned about, doing something really different, maybe you just want to make it for 20 years. We don't care that much. It was, we could have been stronger there. It's interesting to compare this property rights regime in New Zealand with practice in the United States, and I'm sure Evan will have a question or an observation here. But I went to the New Zealand registry and did a search, and I found that there are only 91 spectrum properties in New Zealand as of today. But they include about, well, let's say here, 1.4 gigahertz below 3.6 gigahertz. That's sort of the best spectrum for things like wireless local loop, PCS, cellular. And about 400 gigahertz of that property is held by the minister for the Crown or something like that. But about 1 gigahertz of that is actually privately owned by entities like Vodafone and other wireless carriers. Most of that's the and then there's a lot of spectrum in New Zealand that is owned by the Crown but is authorized under licenses. In practice, the flexible licenses that FCC gives out for PCS or cellular with wide area licenses are really quite similar to the New Zealand property rights. They allow the user to subdivide it, enter into various kinds of tenancy contracts, negotiate with their neighbors as to what appropriate neighbors in both frequency and geography about accepting more interference than the license allows. So they're somewhat similar. And in fact, I can recall clearly in trying to convince people within the New Zealand government about the feasibility of spectrum property rights, I used the U.S. experience with PCS and cellular licenses as an example of how it could work. So, however, there are two big differences, and one is in New Zealand, there's a 20-year term. In the United States, there's, I guess, a 10-year term, but under the law, there's an expectation of renewal, and it's relatively unlikely that somebody with a license will not get it renewed. It's almost exactly a property right in terms of duration, and its duration, there's no question in my mind that the duration of the rights in the United States are actually better than the durations of the rights in New Zealand. However, there's an interesting feature that New Zealand has that the U.S. lacks, and that is when the Crown alienates the spectrum property, sells it off to people, that property includes a provision that says, here's the protection you're going to get against interference. The typical is that nobody will transmit inside your band at a power less than 10 microwatts, minus 50 dBW. And in the United States, there's no comparable protection. So there are always proceedings in the the FCC is full of them, where somebody's saying, well, I want to transmit just a little bit inside somebody else's property. It won't really cause any interference. Maybe it'll cause a little bit of interference, but the economic gain of my doing that is so much greater than their loss, and society should let me do that. And obviously, if that's true in any one transaction, you might be able to imagine a series of an infinite number of transactions that slowly evaporate the value of the property. So the New Zealand protection against these kinds of whittling away at the rights is a big advantage their system has over the U.S. Whether it's worth the term difference, I don't know. And so in practice, the behavior of enterprises with property rights in New Zealand isn't much different than the behavior of a Vodafone affiliate, Verizon, or not affiliate, joint enterprise in the United States, Verizon. They have to use the same technologies. New Zealand's a relatively small country. It's about the size of Colorado with about the same population, so they have to take global technologies and can't really innovate with new technologies that are better matched to their environment or their rights system. But nevertheless, it'd be very interesting to see how things play out over the next few decades, although I must say I wish that New Zealand were 100 times bigger, so it would make sense to develop technologies just for New Zealand and see how it would work. What are the regrets? I have three significant regrets about what happened in New Zealand. Perhaps my biggest is the UHF band. Our report recommended that the UHF band be licensed in, I think it was 6 bands that were relatively wide, and then the licensees would have a fair amount of flexibility to do what they wanted in that, whether broadcasting, land mobile, whatever. New Zealand instead chose to basically auction off some TV networks that fit in that band. In the United States, we've just gone through the process of taking part of the UHF and licensing it off as bands, and that was a difficult fight, took a long time, and the FCC's talking about doing more of that, but for some reason the broadcasters don't see the merits in it. In retrospect, I wish our report had been more persuasive about the benefits of band licenses in the UHF. Our report recommended a Vickery auction, second best auction, and New Zealand did that, and one of the problems with the second best auction, which is fine if you're selling stamps, is that it tells the public the difference between what the government got and what they would have gotten if they'd been a smart monopolist, and something about the nature of the surplus that's going to the winner, and that's unfortunate politically. So nobody uses those for this kind of work anymore. And then finally, I mentioned the duration of rights, and the more I think about it, the more this is my biggest regret, and that if we had argued more strongly for unlimited rights, perhaps it would have been adopted. We did argue for it, but as I say, in pretty wishy-washy fashion. How did Coase influence what happened in New Zealand? I mean, I don't know the whole history, so I can't tell you directly, but I think the mere fact that New Zealand funded the Fountain Report, funded the NERA work, was necessarily a consequence of Coase's 59 paper and the discussion that it stimulated. Fountain Report reflected Coase's papers, spent significant time discussing them. Everybody on our project had read the report. NERA Report quoted Coase extensively. And indeed, the system in New Zealand follows his insights. And as I say, I don't think it would have occurred without his work. What would be done today in New Zealand would be much like it is in other countries that are regulated in a more traditional fashion. Personal reflection, just a little bit more on Coase's influence. I'm an electrical engineer. I'd worked in communications engineering and computers and things like that. I went back to graduate school. I was studying operations research, and the guy I had for my master's thesis advisor was into public safety systems. He said, you know about communications engineering. There's an interesting issue here about how public safety agencies get radio frequencies. What's the best way to assign radio station channels to public safety entities? And I worked at this. I did the usual kind of operations research thing. Said, it's two-dimensional Poisson process and arrivals, and if you use this policy or that policy, which leads to greater saturation, assuming that demand is uniform over an infinite plane. But I was all at the back of my mind. I was very troubled with the fact that how do you trade off between giving a radio channel to Boston or using it twice in a northern and southern suburb, which together are a 20th the size of Boston? And so I'm puzzling this, and at some point I get introduced to the literature, and I say, oh, yeah, geez, that's the answer. And so if you have a bidding system for those licenses and a proper trade-off, then you'll get a much more efficient outcome. It solves the problem of an improper objective function, like trying to get the most licenses out that I had. So on reading that, I became a big fan. And then a few years later, I was working for the House Communications Subcommittee, and for reasons that are detailed in the paper, which I don't have time to go into here, we established a rewrite project for the Communications Act, basically to bog down other bad legislation. I wrote something called the Spectrum Options paper, which proposed, should we think about auctions and things like that? And I got a lot of negative comment in the trade press. And then later, a couple of years later after I wrote that, President Carter endorsed auctions. And, what's that? Not even 20 years later. Congress actually gave the FCC auction authority. Here's an interesting thing to show how times change and progress is made slowly. AT&T didn't like the idea of auctions and property rates at all. But last month at the FCC, they thought they were a great idea. So I guess it just shows a naive conservatism where everybody likes what's the current status quo. I was so upset during the previous paper because I had a quote that I'd left out of both the paper and my slide presentation about lawyer whose name I won't mention for the land mobile interest, who wrote in, it would be impossible to define metes and bounds for spectrum properties. And I said, maybe hard, not impossible. But here's the depressing part of my talk, and that is, suppose the U.S. had really listened to Coase, and in 1960 there must have been dozens of millions of dollars of investment in the UHF spectrum, all in TV stations that were close to going bankrupt or that went bankrupt in a year or two. So for $50 million, you could have bought out all the incumbents and then licensed the UHF band the way I recommended we do it in New Zealand. A bunch of nationwide band licenses across the U.S. There was enough spectrum to do 7 lots of 60 megahertz each. So, and you can kind of guess about who was strong in the industry then and who the winners would be. A couple of big broadcast networks. GE was doing land mobile radio at the time. Western Union hadn't gone kablooey yet. AT&T and Motorola were Powers and Electronics and land mobile. What would have been the outcome if we'd done that? Well, you never know, but it seems likely that we would have gotten cellular-like services with much less reuse or no reuse. But with boatloads of spectrum, you could have, in 1970 there were 24 channels available for voice telephone. 24 simultaneous conversations could be carried out on mobile telephony in New York City. And, that would support average usage rates that were seen back then. That would support 2,000 or 3,000 subscribers in New York. They had like a 4-year waiting list. But I discovered when I was working at the FCC that because I was a government employee, I could get priority, so the waiting list for me was 0. But I couldn't afford the service. Similarly, if CBS and RCA had each had 60 megahertz of spectrum, what do you think they would have done? Well, we never would have seen cable TV in the United States because we would have had 50 channels of over-the-air TV or something like that. All kinds of more clever technologies. And just try, I'm not an economist, and the room's full of good economists, so I'll say this diffidently, but it would have been worth something like $1 trillion in consumer surplus if we'd made that different decision in 1960. And I think you could easily argue it would have been more than that. So I have no doubt that Coase's work was instrumental, was a necessary precondition to the reforms that occurred in New Zealand. It's also had enormous influence as to how we manage spectrum in the United States and the policies that we've adopted. And yet, if you think about what the difference is between what we did and what we could have done, it's just enormous that the further benefits we could have gotten if we'd applied his insights more completely and earlier. Thank you.
Please state your name and push the red button.
Vernon Smith, Chapman University. Charles, I just want to add a short footnote for your favor. I was a consultant to New Zealand Treasury in 1991, and it was on electric power liberalization, and the spectrum auction there had occurred 2 years earlier. I was interested in it because I, of course, have long had this interest in combinatorial auctions, and I saw it as a possible application of that in 1991. So I met with the people that conducted the auction. And it's pretty interesting in terms of regrets. As you know, there's been a lot of criticism of the way they conducted the auction. One of the things I learned was that they had some game theoretic consultants, and that's what they were told. And they recommended the second one, I still bid auction, okay?
So you're taking the responsibility off us?
Yes.
But they reviewed it? That's good to hear.
Yes, and then, well, they were just, they wanted to check you out, apparently. And that's the information. And the other thing, only one thing they regretted was that they weren't 30-year licenses rather than 20.
Well, observation on that. Actually, when there was we didn't put a lot of resources into the form of the auction, but I do remember one discussion where I thought about bringing up combinatorial auctions, and I said, no, I better just keep my mouth shut. We don't want to make this too complicated. So I recall clearly considering it and saying, no, it's already bad enough.
Also, another thing they emphasize, and you have to realize, that New Zealand, you see, has been one of the first democratic socialist paradises. And
that's why their economy
had been a disaster.
Right.
And they got in, and these people, a lot of young people, were involved in the government in the 80s, got why they didn't, you know, they didn't do a lot of work on auction design.
Yeah, no, I mean, I pointed out the difference between what they did in UHF and the issue with the auctions, but it seems to me that the UHF variance from our report is like 10 times as big a mistake as going with what we did recommend, the second best auction.
Yeah. This is more of a comment than a question, but I've had to spend a lot of time in New Zealand. There was a real complete meltdown in 1986 when the Labour Party took over Sir Roger Douglas and Roger Turner, the Treasury. They were all basically free marketeers, although they didn't quite know it at the time. And so the reason that this thing worked as well as it did is that their predispositions were completely the opposite. They got rid of all the export subsidies, all the tariffs, a whole variety of other things that are consistent with this. And the one point I would also make is it's not only that they had a unilateral, unicameral situation there, which made it do in one house, but that was before they had proportionate representation, so you had first past the post. And putting all these things together, they did that within 3 years. Remember, in 1990, for example, they completely redid their legal law on exactly the same kind of position. So this was one of a large numbers of situations, and I can tell you Ronald was actually an influence on the entire game.
Are there any other questions or comments? Go ahead.
Jordan Bacon, UC Law School alumnus. I had a job working on footnotes for the JLE in the 60s, and it's my recollection that there's a paper on free speech and spectrum allocation by Harry Kelvin, who this has to have been prior to 1974, because that's when he died. But I was curious to what extent, my recollection is that CBS was, in some sense, was underwriting the research without having any control over the outcome. If you knew Calvin, you would expect that. But I was just curious if that were some sort of marking the history of spectrum allocation efforts at that time, that Professor Jackson could address that or not.
Well, it's been a number of years since I've read the paper, so I can't comment on any detail, but I do remember it's an important part of the literature and it's quoted and read, but that's about all I can tell you at this point.
Okay, we'll go on. I'm going to stand up and yell at you.
George Mason. Greatly happy consensus. And the only thing I saw that possibly disagree with reference to the necessity for some unlicensed spectrum. The necessity for unlicensed spectrum to be a spot where certain radios can be used without permission. And that was the transactional efficiency. But that's not the transactional efficiency. Okay? Every radio needs some permission from somewhere, and the unlicensed band is set aside by the government. And the government has an approval process for radios. And then once that approval process is in place, yes, then the radios can use that spectrum without permission of the private owner. Now that's not terribly dissimilar, in fact, influenced by the Coasean symmetry. We should see that that's not dissimilar from the idea of using a cell phone. Okay, a cell phone can be used to access radio spectrum with a contract embedded within it. With the permission of the operator, you don't have to get a transaction going, pay or to bargain for the spectrum on each and every phone call. So you have spectrum that's allocated by the state, set aside, and optimized under the state rules. You have spectrum that can be owned by parties and then optimized, and the transactions tend to become efficient because these parties internalize the transaction cost. But the question is where the overall welfare is larger. So it's not a matter of eliminating transaction costs anywhere. There's still transaction costs in the government set aside versus the private.
Well, there's some implicit question there. One, we recommended the government have the option in the statute. Yes, there is. The question is Tom right? The answer is, I don't think so. I think that unlicensed spectrum can serve efficiency in a variety of circumstances, and that the argument he makes is true only if there aren't certain kinds of transaction costs which overwhelm the property rights mechanism, and for a variety of historical and practical reasons, I don't think that necessarily holds, and we've got an enormous economic benefit from unlicensed spectrum, and I notice it's being used around here because out at the registration thing they tell you how to use Wi-Fi. So there's a benefit to it, and the question is the balance between licensed and unlicensed. We got a boatload of spectrum for unlicensed applications. I don't think we need more.
Okay, we'll have to conclude.
Thank you, yes. So this is joint work with Evan Carell, who's sitting right here, and Greg and Andy, unfortunately, are still in Palo Alto. But they regret not being here. And I'm going to talk about spectrum auctions and the impact on competition for wireless services. As we all know, Ronald Coase had this radical idea 50 years ago that maybe we should define property rights and auction the spectrum to the highest bidder. And I'm pleased to report, as you know, that 35 years after that date, we did have auctions. And here, beginning in July of 1994 in the United States, and here is Al Gore and Bill Clinton and Reed Hunt holding a very big check for $7.7 billion written out to the American taxpayer. So that's all very nice. But what I really love about this photograph is the huge banner at the top, government with common sense. Because after all, we all know this was just common sense, and it is just a matter of clearly articulating the common sense so that it overwhelms the special interests that upset it. And it was such a remarkable accomplishment, that not that it happened so quickly, and 35 years really is pretty quick, but the FCC actually implemented the auctions in a very clever and successful way. They consulted experts. They came together with a very effective design right from the get-go that's been used for now 70 auctions and been adopted pretty much across the world. Now, it's not a perfect design. I'm going to talk about some of the problems with the design, and it's improved over time. But it really is quite a remarkable accomplishment. But just so you don't get the wrong idea that government discovered common sense in 1994 and then didn't forget, let's look at the remarks of Senator Schumer from last year on the FAA's plan to auction takeoff and landing slots at the New York City airports. So here, again, it seems like this would be a reasonable way to manage congestion in the New York City airports, to find a property right and auction it off to the highest bidders and do some work and come up with a good auction design. And in fact, that's exactly what the FAA did. They actually did a lot of work on this and consulted experts, and there were numerous conferences and training and all sorts of things. So this was actually very well thought out. It wasn't a perfect plan, as Mike Levine would certainly agree, but it was some common sense and a step forward. But Schumer didn't quite think so, and ultimately it actually almost was, the auction almost occurred on January the 14th, but for the court staying the auction under strong industry pressure, and then for Congress banning auctions at New York City airports in legislation in February. So back to spectrum. Spectrum is a very interesting auction environment because it is so darn complicated. We're auctioning many things. They're heterogeneous but similar. There's competing technologies, especially nowadays. You might want to use and the competing technologies need the spectrum organized in different ways. So you might have a technology like WiMAX, which wants unpaired spectrum, or long-term evolution, which wants paired spectrum. And somehow we'd like to have an auction that accommodated these different uses. The structure of substitutes and complements is very complex. There's large asymmetries. One of the largest is the incumbency issue. There's incumbents and there's entrants. and it's a long-term market, at least right now. In the future, the hardware will be flexible enough, say 30 years from now, that in fact the market might look more like electricity, where we've got real-time market, medium-term market, long-term markets. But for right now, it's a long-term market because of the substantial specific investments that the network operators need to make. The goal in the auction, we would argue, is efficiency, making the best use of the scarce spectrum. And the point that we want to emphasize today is that efficiency is actually a little bit tricky here. It's not just auctioning it to the highest bidder. We have to recognize competition issues in the downstream market. So an effective spectrum policy will encourage competition both within the auction and in the downstream market for wireless services. Coase, in his 59 paper, recognized the competition problem, as illustrated by this quote. He did not deal with it in his paper, and wisely so, because the first thing was to clearly articulate why this made sense and basically debunked all the crazy arguments that were given why auctions would certainly not work. But in terms of the competition issue, the basic problem is that auctioning the highest bidder need not put the spectrum to its best use. The bidder's private value may differ from the social value, and one reason for this difference, certainly not the only one, but one of the reasons is that let's say you're an incumbent, the incumbent's private value will be the incremental value of the extra spectrum, plus the benefit of keeping the spectrum from a competitor. And so that motivates why you might want to have some interventions rather than an auction in which everybody competes on exactly the same basis. So to flesh out the example a little bit more, just think of an incumbent who has a license for spectrum and another license becomes available. An entrant is interested in it, but now you hold an auction. The entrant's value is going to be the profits that they would get in the ensuing duopoly. The incumbent's value is the incremental value of the spectrum plus the value of foreclosing the competition, keeping the entrant out. And this often will cause the incumbent to win the auction, even in circumstances where the incumbent doesn't have the higher social value. The problem can get even worse in that the entrant will understand this, and then, to the extent there's participation costs, won't even seriously participate in the auction, and so the incumbent may get the spectrum for a very low price. So that motivates the interventions which are possible, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of my time. So how can the regulator enhance competition? Well, they could use spectrum caps, set-asides, bidding credits. The band plan can make a difference. The auction design certainly makes a difference. They've got antitrust enforcement and merger policy, which I'm not going to talk about, and probably the most important is regulatory policy, which I'm not going to talk about because I'm going to focus on just the auction elements. So I'm going to focus on the first 5 elements. So first, spectrum caps. And here actually is a very nice, I don't want to be too positive, the FCC's done a lot of things wrong, of course, but this was one thing they definitely did right. In the early U.S. broadband auctions, which were the PCS auctions, we were in a situation where we had a duopoly throughout the United States, the 2 cellular incumbents, each with a 25 megahertz license. The FCC had available now, and this was the band plan was such that they were going to auction 3 large PCS licenses of 30 megahertz each and 3 small licenses of 10 megahertz each. And so what they decided to do was that they recognized the competition problem, that if they just said, okay, open bidding, high bidder wins, then what would happen is the outcome would be much too concentrated. The cellular incumbents would have a strong incentive to win more than they should from a social perspective. And so they introduced 45 megahertz spectrum cap, which was really nice because what it did was it prevented, as you can see, 25 plus 30 is more than 45, so it prevented the cellular incumbents from competing for those large licenses. and it also prevented any entrant from acquiring too large licenses. So it meant that there were going to be 5 operators, and so there had to be 3 new entrants, and that turned out to be incredibly important and led to a period of vibrant competition and innovation and dramatically lower prices with much better services, all the things you would expect. So it was really a wonderful time, and to some extent still is. The cap is now gone. It was eliminated about 3 years ago, and as a consequence, there's been the FCC since then has introduced, have more auctions with more spectrum. The AWS auction was one, the 700 megahertz was another big one, and there's been consolidation since then. Now we've got 4 nationwide operators, and there is some concern that the number 1 and 2 of those 4 are becoming a little bit too dominant. That's AT&T and Verizon, but time will tell. So this is something that still needs to be looked at. But this was a great success. Set-asides, like spectrum caps, also can motivate participation in the auction and guarantee entry. A good example of use is in the UK 3G auctions, where they had 4 incumbents and decided to offer. First, they decided they thought, well, we'll have 4 licenses, but then they realized that would be problematic for competition in the auction. So they introduced a 5th license and made that a set-aside for a new entrant, and that was the largest and most attractive of the 5 licenses. A bidder can only win 1, so entry is guaranteed. It motivates participation by viable entrants, and in fact, it attracted 9 highly qualified entrants and set record prices, and not just for the set-aside license, because of course these entrants could bid on the non-set-aside licenses as well, so they spilled over, and it resulted in high prices for all the parties and the introduction of another operator. Another good example is the Canadian AWS auction, which had at the time, and still does, has in a lot of markets just 2 operators. Some markets more, but many markets just 2 operators. And there was a great fear that these 2 operators would win all the AWS spectrum, and so they did the same thing. They introduced set-asides, and there was at least 1 major entrant in each area. And the auction was much more competitive and resulted in more revenues for the Canadians. Bidding credits, another form of preference. This is a price instrument rather than a quantity instrument, set-asides being a quantity instrument. Bidding credits, you get a 25% discount effectively, or 40%, whatever it is. 25%, then I bid $100 million, I only have to pay 75. The FCC used this to favor, in the end, small businesses rather than entrants, and they certainly encourage the favored group, and it can increase auction competition and result in higher revenues and potentially some very desirable things. The U.S. is pretty much alone in their use of bidding credits for spectrum auctions. The problem, there is this dark side of these preferences, both set-asides and bidding credits. And one of the problems is it encourages fronts, and this is exactly what happened in the FCC auctions. Is companies were established, small businesses were established specifically to just get the spectrum at the discount and then have the big guy use it. So the FCC lawyers try to make that not happen, but initially they set fairly loose control rules that allowed for this possibility, and it certainly did happen, and it happened at big scale in the broadband auctions, with this tactic being used quite effectively by AT&T and Singular, who are now one. One thing is for broadband wireless, there's not much economic justification for favoring small businesses, because broadband wireless is not a small business operation. I mean, this is going to require billions of dollars. So you don't. Most small businesses don't have billions of dollars to spend. The other problem is the incumbent may well be the efficient winner, so you have to be careful about these things, and of course it's highly political. The worst mistake the FCC made was an additional preference given to small businesses, because small businesses, they don't have money, that's sort of a problem, and they need to spend billions. So introduce installment payments and don't have them pay any interest or anything for at least the first 5 years. And what happened with that was they came in droves to bid, the prices went to the roof, and with a lot of speculative bidding, they couldn't pay. They defaulted. The whole thing was tied up in the courts for essentially 10 years. So there was a huge delay, an enormous waste, and overall, if you looked at the overall economics of this, was the program successful, you'd have to say that the preferences in the United States were largely unsuccessful, with a strong exception of the spectrum, the spectrum capped initially. Now turning to the band plan. The band plan can greatly affect competition in the market. Now the way the band plan works is the FCC in all their auctions, and almost all the auctions around the world, the regulator establishes a rigid band plan. So they slice the spectrum out both in frequency and in geography, as is shown here for the AWS auction. How do they do it? Well, they do it by all the guys that are interested in participating coming and lobbying them and saying exactly what they want. Well, there's a strong tendency in this process for the regulator to give them, essentially something you want. Verizon, you want really big licenses. Okay, we do some big licenses here. You're a smaller operator, you want smaller licenses, we'll do that over here. And the problem with that is it undermines competition in the auction, because it effectively supports tacit collusion, where everybody sort of knows what they're supposed to win, and then they go into the auction, the simultaneous ascending process, and they win what they're supposed to win, and sometimes at low prices. This was actually a fairly competitive auction, as it turns out, but all this slicing and dicing of the spectrum actually reduced the efficiency of the auction and the ability of the bidders to substitute across the different spectrum. The auction design, and in fact the latest auction designs that countries are now looking at, are accommodating flexible band plans, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The simultaneous ascending auction is what has been the real workhorse for spectrum auctions around the world since introduced by the FCC in July of 1994. And the reason is it's a very simple process. All the licenses are on the trading block. They each has a price associated with it. The bidders can bid on what they want, and the price is raised until nobody's willing to bid higher. There's some technical rules to make it all work even better, but that's the basic idea. So it's a simple price discovery process. It allows the bidders to arbitrage across substitutes and piece together complementary licenses. And the price discovery also reduces the winner's curse, the bidder uncertainty about value, and that's all well and good, but we've observed that it does have a number of weaknesses, and these are sort of all the strategic things that the bidders do, especially when it's implemented with full transparency as typically done. And I'm not going to go through all those, but it is a long list. The approaches to auction design going forward try to address those weaknesses. And one of the big things that can be accomplished now using, for example, a combinatorial clock auction or a package clock auction, in which you can bid on packages of things, is you can have an auction which accommodates a flexible band plan. So rather than have the regulator decide what the band plan is, you get the auction, the bidder's bids to decide what the band plan should be. And this is very important in instances where you have competing technologies, and that those competing technologies need the spectrum organized in different ways. The newer auction designs also enhance substitution, both through the way the products are defined. So typically they'll involve the use of auctioning generic spectrum first, rather than specific assignments. You'll bid of what really matters to you, which is the quantity of spectrum that you have in an area, and then we'll work out secondarily the specific location. And this facilitates substitution, because now the generic spectrum, it's all a homogeneous good. And then the auction design can be much simpler as well, and more competitive. Like the original FCC design, they encourage price discovery. It's a dynamic process, and they work harder at trying to eliminate a lot of the strategic manipulations the bidders go through by trying to induce truthful bidding through an effective pricing rule and activity rule. So let me conclude with some recommendations for the regulator. First, adopt pro-competitive regulatory policy. Now, these are actually things that are really important that I haven't been talking about. You know, things like the interconnection rules, the number portability, tower sharing arrangements, roaming arrangements. You know, there's a much longer list. Flexible use, the definition of the property rights, and so on. Second, make more spectrum available. So, you know, this is the biggest thing. When you're talking about competition, the most important thing is getting the spectrum out there. So find it, relocate effectively where you have to, and make it available. Focus on efficiency, not revenues. Focusing on revenues tends to be short-sighted, and this is just much too important to focus on the short-term revenues. And finally, encourage competition where you really need to, both in the auction and in the market for wireless services, but be careful in your use of these instruments. We certainly have some good examples where things did not go well, and the Hippocratic Oath certainly applies to this case.
Again, we have a few minutes for questions. Raise your hand if you have a question or a comment. All the way in the back, Charles.
Yeah, Chuck Jackson. Peter, a question. You talked about the importance of design of the PCS auctions and the spectrum cap competition, but perhaps a different design of property rights that can be auctioned off would solve those problems with much less complexity. I mean, if nationwide licenses have been auctioned, say 30 megahertz each or something like that, and a rule that we could buy more than one, maybe incumbents would have bought them to give a better footprint, maybe the vendors would have bought them, maybe you guaranteed the competitive industry structure at one far more efficient than resulted from the FCC auction. If the FCC structure had been more efficient, both auction transactions could benefit. Is that correct?
Well, it's certainly correct that there was, I think looking back, we've observed now that this strong preference for nationwide operators, and that's been the evolution of the industry. So looking back, I think that would be a strong case for having some nationwide licenses, some nationwide licenses, perhaps all nationwide licenses. But you don't actually, I think the FCC was right that they didn't know that. And some slicing, it's probably not even true, I mean, there are regional operators. And so some slicing had to occur. But I agree that there's been, because of the lobbying process that determines band plan, there's been excessive slicing and dicing of the spectrum that has probably undermined efficiency in many circumstances.
Mike Jane, NYU. Peter, one of the things that's interesting is this question of how do you get incumbents to reveal the value of the monopoly aspect of their bid as opposed to the operation value aspect. As you know, I've suggested at one point that you have an auction in which you publicize the size of, but not the identity of the second highest bidder. You allow the incumbent to bid, but that bid became transparent, thus forcing evaluation of the endowment effect and also the possibility of the anti-competitive effect of the bid. I just wondered what role you thought that might have in these kinds of auctions.
Well, I actually agree with you that you need to look at the asymmetry and then see how best they handle it. And there's there are different ways, and I described the set aside and bidding credit, but you can also address it through the information policy, as you suggest. And in fact, I've recommended that in various situations. One that's going on right now, the auction that the Treasury is conducting for warrants, the TARP warrants, JP Morgan and City One, Capital One. And there, the bank the issuing bank has lots more information. And so we've recommended that, in fact, they have an auction, and the bank's allowed to bid, the bank bids first and puts its bid out there as the bid to beat. And so that's another way of addressing the asymmetry, just as you suggested.
Just quickly to follow up, aren't methods like that much cleaner, if you will, than the sort of set-asides and other sorts of manipulations that you described?
I think that they are in certain circumstances, and that's why we recommended it with respect to the warrants. The Treasury, of course, is doing that. They're letting JP Morgan bid on an equal basis. And we'll see what the result is in the next week or so. But, I think that if there are other methods, you have to look carefully at the problems and see what the best approach is. But I think that there was a strong case for, in the broadband auctions, for the stronger, simply exclusion from winning a larger license. After all, the way it was structured, they could buy, if they valued the incremental spectrum a great deal, they could buy an additional 20 megahertz through those small licenses.
This will win.
Ms. Gilbert from ISIS, George Mason University. And of course, you addressed property rights and the rules as ways of making the auction more efficient. And we also look at contracts. We have contracts. For example, you say that installment payments here, which basically being prohibited to vendors. It basically means they have to discount some sort of future value and paid up front. And this could be paid, for example, over 10 years, as an example. And also, there are dual values, as you point out, for the incumbents. And so the question is that having looked at different contracts as a way to solve the problems, not all the rules and the property rights.
So contracts between...
Types of contracts, for example.
Types of contracts?
Yes.
But between the regulator and the operator, or between operators?
Yeah, between the seller and buyer.
Okay, yeah.
Understand the question, to be honest, but one of the things that we consider, maybe you can help me here, one of the things about auctions is it has a sort of predefined contract in there. It's beautiful and not negotiated. So, to put this in an auction context, I mean, maybe there's an issue about how do you define the property rights. And, here did, talk about that very briefly in the sense that to the extent, that you can make the property rights fungible, that leads to a more efficient auction. So within the auction contract context, that's how I would interpret that. Sort of the standard contract which defines the property rights.
The language that I usually use is the product design. So that's the contract. That's what you're talking about. And that turns out to be hugely important in any auction design context. What are you auctioning? And I agree that's critically important. And I actually think the FCC is doing a good job on that front. It's very relevant.
So, thank you very much for having me, and it's just a great honor to be here for a celebration of Ronald Coase's work, and I certainly want to thank Roger Knoll and Greg Roston and the indefatigable Richard Epstein. Living proof that Ayn Rand and Jerry Lewis were far more than casual acquaintances. I don't get to use that line much, but thank you, University of Chicago. We want to talk about the 1959 paper by Ronald Coase, Ronald Coase, and this is an important paper. In fact, this whole conference got started when somebody started thinking, you know, that's a damn interesting paper. 50 years ago, somebody wrote a paper that's had an amazing impact on the world, and just this one set of ideas has gone out and really changed a lot. Now, the paper would never have been published. The paper would never have been published if the editors at the Journal of Law and Economics had been right. They insisted that there was an error, a fundamental flaw in the paper, and that Coase did not understand externalities. Coase argued, okay, if there is an error, it is a very interesting error, and you should publish this paper. Now, I have used that argument, I can't tell you how many times. But for some reason, that generation of editors at the Journal of Law and Economics here at the University of Chicago bought it, published the paper, and then immediately invited Coase to explain his error in the paper that became The Problem of Social Cost. So that's where we are. And in thinking about this remarkable achievement in this interesting error, we reference Ronald Coase's other admonition. He said, an economist, this is not in the 59 paper, an economist who is able to postpone by a week a government program which wastes $100 million a year has, by his action, earned his salary for the whole of his life. Okay? So by symmetry, we say that the standard applies when research brings a good law sooner. We think that FCC license auctions have been good. And they've been brought about sooner because of Coase's work. Let's assume they got here 10 years sooner. The receipts thus far in the United States have been $52.6 billion actually collected. So the Coase 59 paper on the Coasean standard pays back society for Ronald Coase's lifetime earnings plus 273,519 of his colleagues, and that doesn't count the overseas rights because auction revenues internationally have been more than twice the U.S. level. So, as one of the free riders on the Coase contribution, I'm happy to talk about three great contributions in this 59 paper. First, Ronald diagnosed the externality problem in a very interesting way, and in fact he doesn't use the term externality, and later made much of the fact that he did not use the term externality, calling these spillovers harmful effects. And he placed them in he sort of regularized the economic analysis of how we deal with those harmful effects, just as they are ordinary economic costs. That gave us an analytical symmetry that, of course, drove the 1960 paper, and we're still using quite fruitfully today. Secondly, the paper makes this normative argument. It's very Smithian, Adam Smithian, in the sense of taking a normative argument and really discovering a lot about the world on the pathway to a policy conclusion. And much of this in the paper, of course, is devoted to seeing private property rights for spectrum as a way to create spectrum markets, and for that market allocation of the resource to surpass the efficiency of the state property regime then in place. And that prediction, which was based on theory, it really was just a Smithian analysis applied to property rights to radio spectrum, did not have a lot of empirical substance at the time, because Coase was operating under the state property regime and considered it quite theoretically. It turns out that the prediction has now been tested, and you heard this nice presentation by Chuck Jackson talking about one of the important series of reforms, but also it has been very important in the United States and other markets, particularly in defining mobile wireless licenses, and market allocation of spectrum does surpass in performance the state property model as a general rule. And thirdly, he did say what he's famously noted for saying in that 59 paper, that it'd be great to assign property rights by auction, not by fiat. And this also leads to this focus on separating the input allocations from the eventual outputs, and that drives so much of our thinking, particularly the interesting paper by Stavens and Hahn that we've already talked about, and is important too. So I'm going to take a shot at a couple, not the top one here, but talk about auctions first, and then a little bit about exclusive spectrum rights, and then turn it over to my colleagues. We've already talked a little bit about this. You have to go back really 50 years to see how alone Ronald Coase was, okay? And Coase in this video talked about how he goes to the FCC in 59 and they say, is this all a big joke? Well, the Rand Corporation actually commissioned a paper for Coase to do a follow-up to his 59 analysis. And the follow-up, which he wrote with William Meckling and Jorah Menashian, was a 200-page policy report telling us how specifically to create a property instrument for radio spectrum. Rand suppressed the study because it got back referees' reports that said things like this, and were literally warning Rand if it published this paper, it would lose a lot of funding. Then as late as 1977, you have people joking about this at the FCC. Two commission members actually put in a document that the chances that auctions would be adopted were about as likely as those on the Easter Bunny in the Preakness. So what was the problem? Well, the absolute consensus amongst communications policy experts, and it really is fascinating to look back at just from the standpoint of sort of a philosophy of science perspective, but the absolute rock-solid consensus was that you could not have auctions, okay? And actually the two leading reasons were actually somewhat contradictory. First of all, spectrum property rights could just not be defined and sold. Technically, and I think Chuck Jackson referred to some of this was an argument, spillovers were endemic and property ownership was chaotic. There was a government report that called it etheric bedlam. Almost, the Supreme Court once called it a cacophony of competing voices. So you just couldn't do it. It just wasn't possible to do it. And then the fallback argument was sort of the opposite. Well, if you could do it, you wouldn't get the right outputs by allocating the inputs this way, by auction. So that was what Coase was against. Everybody believed that. The FCC and all the establishment, and even the Rand Corporation was afraid to, as a think tank, step out. So that universal consensus was there. And Coase saw, just on theory, that whatever rights were delimited could be assigned by auction and could be traded in secondary markets. And whatever public interests were important to impose on the actors in this market could be embedded into those licenses. Okay? And in fact, he saw these kinds of constrained licenses trading in the market. So he thought he had some empirical basis, and in fact, he did. So it turns out that we got licensed. You should have put $2 on the bunny. Okay. So we get the license auctions, and we got a lot of revenues, and in fact, this is quite widespread. And, there you have it. So, and I thank Vernon for putting on the bunny suit. So, now the more important part of the article, as important as auctions may be for licenses, is the general idea of liberalizing property rights and having spectrum ownership allow markets to allocate the resource. And in fact, some countries have jumped farther along in this, New Zealand being one of them, trying to have de jure ownership rights. But in fact, de facto spectrum ownership, like in mobile licenses in the United States, really have proven enormously successful and have allowed, indeed, mobile markets to produce vast amounts of welfare that could not be generated under an alternative system of state property. So we generate more than $150 billion a year in the U.S. cellular market alone, just in consumer surplus. And the only way, again, we get that is to have an exclusive ownership model that encourages this very substantial investment in complementary network infrastructure. Only with owned spectrum resources do you get that. So those rules are actually creating social revolution. I mean, it's just, you look around the world, 4.6 billion, just to say 4.6 billion mobile phone subscribers. And it brushes off you because you know this number's out there, you know everybody's got a cell phone now, but I don't think there are 4.6 billion people in the world with cell phones. So by the way, OMG, a little text humor there. Okay. So, spectrum markets perform as predicted, but regulatory bottlenecks continue. Okay, so part of the Coasean vision has gotten out. We license we auction the licenses. We also have liberalization in a small part of the world, which is the mobile sector, in these mobile licenses. But it turns out that we've been very parsimonious, we meaning the regulators, have been very parsimonious in getting out more bandwidth. And Peter Crampton mentioned this in his talk a moment ago. And in fact, we note in our paper that the license auctions may actually help exacerbate the over-conservatism of regulators, because now when you issue new licenses, the entrants or the recipients of the new rights have to pay market price for the licenses. And that, in fact, takes the rents off the table. We like that. It cleans up all that rent-seeking competition, but it eliminates productive rent-seeking, which is to get more spectrum into the market. So it's the product of halfway reform, reforming the assignment process and not the underlying resource allocation process. And if you look at the actual revenues that have come in, this is billions of dollars per year. I've got some dotted lines for revenues that weren't collected. In fact, over 30% of the total revenues or winning bids have not been collected. And Peter made a passing reference to that. But over the more than $50 billion generated in 15 years of U.S. license auctions, you can see that there was an initial blast up there, and particularly these PCS licenses that made the cellular market so much more competitive. When those licenses come in the market, the price of 50 cents per minute, this is the average revenue per minute, this is when the licenses are coming in the market, it just plummets. And so now we're about 6 cents a minute for service. We were over 50 cents a minute here in the mid-90s before those licenses came in, and there was just very positive effect of competition. Peter talked about that. But then there was a spectrum drought. There was no more product coming into the input markets. And that has been a very serious constraint, particularly in the development of mobile bandwidth in markets for mobile broadband. So we hypothesized that some of this delay in getting more spectrum out could be accounted for by this incomplete liberalization, if you will, in the underlying spectrum allocation system. So I just like to put this headline up here. For many years, this was the one thing that the lobbyists could get out of the Federal Communications Commission or Congress, and that was a delay. That's a spectrum auction delay hits fast track, is the in the trade press. There's no irony intended. This is exactly what you lobby for. Anyway, so that problem is something we do talk about cleaning up and going forward after these great contributions of Coase. And David, you want to? David's up. Is that for David or me?
Well, here's a rule you guys need to remember. I forgot this one. You really don't want to follow Tom. Okay, because I'm not going to be as entertaining, but it's going to be easy to add more content. Let me talk about auction design and the implementation from the FCC auctions. And Peter already mentioned a lot of what I'm going to say, at least at the beginning here, is these auctions are pretty complex. It's certainly putting together the properties and all the rules, and lots can go wrong, and sometimes it did, especially in sort of the behavior of the bidders taking advantage of those rules that were out there. But all those major problems have been corrected. A lot were kind of easy to have noticed, but the new rules tend to take care of all the ones that are fairly obvious. There's one that still needs some work, and I'm going to talk about the aggregation risk, sort of the case for combinatorial bidding. And, this is pretty standard, but as you know, that the way the FCC does this is they have lots of, the licenses are defined by geographic area and then the megahertz in them. And there's lots of different licenses that are offered in an auction, and if you're interested in getting an entire footprint of the U.S., you have to cobble together all those licenses. And if you care about them in combination and you're trying to do them piecemeal, you put yourself at risk if you don't get all of the combinations that you're interested in. So here's one picture that'll show you that all the population is not the same, and it's certainly the last 10% is kind of important. So what you see here is the cost from the advanced wireless service A blocks of that auction, those licenses. 2006, thank you. I was there, remember? We both were there. Anyway, you'll see the incremental costs, or if you want to think the bids that were paid for the lowest 10, the next 10, and so forth. And you'll see as you try to get more and more of the population, that last 10%, the incremental is fairly high, okay? And if you don't get those, you can see there's a big value for getting those, and it's reflected in the prices. Here's a picture that looks at nationwide coverage, the percent of nationwide coverage in terms of population, and the total cost from the A, B, and C block of AWS, the auction. And you'll see down at the low ends of coverage, you can get them relatively cheap, but as you try to get more and more coverage, that cost goes up, and this is part of the premium that you pay for trying to aggregate. And so I'm just going to look at the B block, and I'm going to add here a straight line from 0 all the way up to 100. So if you wanted to get 100, you could see that you're going to pay around 250 megahertz pop. And so if you're just getting 60% of the coverage, then you get a 40% discount if you want to think of it, okay? If you're willing to do less than 100% of the coverage. And Tom and I were consultants for one company that was trying to get nationwide coverage, and they were really trying hard until they were finally convinced that, 80 is almost like 100. And at the end, and you have to be in a room to see Tom describe that 80 is, 20% is, who cares, And it turned out to be a great strategy. It's like the idiot savant of auction, strategy, that the amount of savings was amazing. And so you can see that for 60%, you can see for 80, Thompson, it's about 180% premium to go up from 60 to 100%. So the question is, how do you deal with this aggregation risk? And we've talked about spectrum needing the product to be liberalized, but there's also bidding that needs to be liberalized. And it is true, without a doubt, that the FCC auctions are simple, okay? They're very simple, sort of. There's lots of rules. You've got to have lots of consultants there to help you, so they're not that simple. But the rules seem very, straightforward. What's not simple is participating in them, Okay? There's a lot to do if you're a bidder, especially if you're trying to aggregate these. So while it's simple from the, from the FCC's point of view that these rules are simple, they're trying to complete, if you try to be, on the other side, be the participant, not so simple, okay? And my suggestion is that, I've said this all along, that we move towards combinatorial auctions. And what I really want to say here is something that I said to one of my colleagues before I went out here to come give this talk. Steve Rosseni, in the late 70s, proposed, designed, and tested in the lab the first combinatorial auction. And this was for takeoff and landing slots at airports. That's almost 35 years. So I told him, you're almost there. I think that's it, right? Yeah. Okay. Vernon? Yeah, Vernon, you're next. Here, we'll do. There you go.
Does this phone work here? Can you hear me? I'll just sit down since we're going to go right into questions, right?
Well, I think this quote here is enough for everybody.
Well, they can see that, but my function here is to, given my two colleagues, is to neither provide content nor humor. But Tom wanted to give me a slide, and this is it. And what I want to comment on was this comes from my personal experience. I never read either of these papers of Coase until, either the 59 paper, the 1960 paper. I don't think, it must have been the late 70s. It was much later. And I was interested, though. There was all this literature on the Coase theorem. Okay, and I read some of these papers, looked at them, and here all of these were about the Coase theorem, in which liability didn't make any difference if there were no information, transactions, enforcement, and so forth, costs. So I was curious about that, so I got out and I read Coase's 1960 paper for the first time. And I still didn't understand where all this literature was coming from. There is a very brief discussion in the paper, which I interpreted as a spoof of economic theory. The guy is just doing a spoof. The real point of the paper is not that. It's all this other stuff. And so what mystified me was that the economics profession was picking up on this thing, which was, well, of course, I didn't know then, and we all learned later, that it was our friend George Stigler that christened it the Coase theorem, and I've always seen that as an incredible distraction from what Coase's message really was. I did want to mention one other anecdote. George Shepard in 1994 edited a volume called Rejected. Leading economists ponder the publication process. I don't know whether they asked Tom. But George Shepard sent out letters to a number of leading economists. And the question is, have you ever had any papers rejected, and what was your experience? And were there any of them really quite famous papers? Well, they sent this letter to Coase. And Coase's response is very interesting. He says, I'm sorry, I can't help you. He says, I never had anything rejected. He says, I only published a few papers, and in every case, I was either the editor or I knew the editor.
Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions. Again,
we have to give the Coasean value of the marginal product test. The answer is Ronald Coase passes, and he brings along a few thousand of his closest friends.
Thank you. Yes, right there.
Mark Shelton, Forbes magazine. Prior to auctions, the FCC had lotteries. And I'm curious if you have studied, many of you have studied the impact of the lottery system, which was financially much to desire. I mean, it was great for those who won the lotteries. And a lot of them were individuals who knew nothing about cellular. And so what happened there with the government, with the FCC? When did they see the light, so to speak, and realize, and how much money did they leave, did they miss out on? It must have been billions, if not trillions.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thank you. Yes, yeah, I wrote about lotteries 1993 in the Southern Economic Journal, and I'd be happy to send you that. It's an excellent article. The cost.
He knew the editor.
On the cost of rent seeking. There was probably somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion spent in the lottery, because, by the way, it wasn't just a lottery. You had to prove to the FCC that you were a real phone company. And the United States was very productive during that period, because we came up with about 280,000 new phone companies. There were these application mills that popped up, and they allowed you to do applications across, well, in the rural markets, 428 applications, one per market, because we had the 734 national local franchises. Anyway, at the end of that, you actually had significant social expense. And in fact, the famous thing was that there was a warehouse that collapsed, the government warehouse that collapsed under all the paper in Pennsylvania, storing FCC documents. And by the way, the FCC defense is the warehouse didn't collapse. It was just the inside of the warehouse that collapsed. That's the actual defense of that. The building is still there. But anyway, it was pre-electronic, so you had to have all this stuff with paper. And I have to admit, I did a stint at the FCC where Evan Quarell tried to teach me something and failed. But I gave a talk that said, if we're going to have lotteries, that's when we were doing lotteries, we should forget this charade, and we should at least draw Social Security numbers so that we eliminate the social expense. Whereupon one of the commission members, Irvin Duggan, started giving speeches that an unnamed FCC official had come up with the worst idea he had ever heard of, because they treated this process as some again, even under lotteries, random selection as a sacred process where they were selecting some optimum. So anyway, the shorter answer is the FCC was not the agency that was actually forcing that. Lotteries were a compromise between what Chuck Jackson showed, lobbying by the executive branch, starting at least in the Carter years, if not before, to get auction authority, and the oversight committees on Capitol Hill, oversight of the FCC, that wanted more discretion, not less, and didn't want to give auction authority to the FCC. Lotteries were a compromise. And the FCC really shouldn't be blamed as the agency that was responsible for that. That was just the ugly, sausage-like outcome of that compromise. And then when you got, and then there was the gamesmanship of don't allow a Republican president to take credit and this and that. Finally, when you got unified government in '93, and you had another round of mobile licenses going out, PCS, the political and economic cards lined up, and you immediately and you had some deficit issues that you wanted to raise more revenue. Yes, we got the auctions in '93.
Gary?
Yeah, I'm actually glad that this conversation was taking place, because I was thinking of with this discussion of auctions and benefits of it and so forth. And certainly there's a lot to be said there, but had we had a less compromised lottery system, it would seem that there could have been social advantages or social benefits in having the grants remain in the private sector, rather than having this $54 billion or whatever you showed transferred to the state. And it would seem like it would be fairly easy to calculate what those might look like had they stayed in the private sector and then produced So I just wondered if anybody could sort of play that game.
Vernon? I didn't hear it all on the disadvantages of being my age. I don't hear.
You say if you have an efficient lottery, like Social Security numbers out of a hat, okay? So there's no social expense, and you can just assign the the rights, and then it's a windfall. People then sell out to AT&T or Verizon.
It would quickly go to the higher bidders, I would expect.
But he says what the advantage is to keep the rents in the private sector. So
yes.
Well, I think there's a second part to that, Gary, and that is that assembling these in the secondary market from all the individuals is not free. Okay, and so the reason to do the auction supposedly is to make sure you get all that stuff done right up front. Okay, so it's a hard to make the decision. Well, is it more efficient to do it that way, or allow the secondary markets to pop up and allow combinatorial markets to just secondary ones to pop up by themselves and so forth? There is an experience with that in reclaim, for pollution permits that. They were grandfathered out, and there was a serious combinatorial problem for getting these over the years, and a company came in and actually created that secondary market to do that. So, it's possible.
Toward the back.
Turn on. Can you turn on the red button? Speak into the mic.
Southeast University of Science and Economics.
Can't hear you.
And also a senior trainer at Information Economic Project at Mason Law School. When reflecting on the selective clarity of Professor Coase on radio spectrum, what I suggest to connect with another paper published in 1972. In this paper, durability and monopoly. Coase basically says a monopoly here is government sell more of the durable goods at some date. It depreciates the value of unit sold at early date. The prospect of further sales improve its early balance value of expropriation and make them reluctant to purchase. So I think that this paper also relates to the radio spectrum management. Now the U.S. government actually auctioned the spectrum piecemeal. And now, for example, they just auctioned the 700 megahertz spectrum, maybe more than 4 years ago. But now they want to auction another, they want to make the other spectrum used for maybe unlicensed or unlicensed. It actually flows the market, and so depreciates the value of the auction spectrum. So it's also related to the radio spectrum. I say maybe in your paper, and you maybe collect this 19th century paper, and then enrich your reflection on it.
Yeah, no, we touch a little on that. I mean, the idea that there's this parsimonious allocation coming out for new spectrum, and it's combined with the auction regime, creates certain problems. In fact, it actually came up in the bankruptcies for the PCS licenses with the bidder credits. They claimed that the government tricked them into bidding so high. This is in bankruptcy court. And they claim that the crafty, wily folks at the FCC tricked them into bidding so much, and that after they had made these high bids, then the FCC dumped a whole bunch more spectrum out there in the market and drove the prices down, and the bankruptcy court should write down their debt. And guess what? The bankruptcy courts did write down the debts, and it was not a pretty picture. But the answer. I'm here at the University of Chicago, so reduce the money supply. That's the old joke about the kid who wakes up in Milton Friedman's class when he's fallen asleep and gets hit in the head with the eraser. So reflexively, the answer is liberalize the spectrum regime, allow there to be a lot more spectrum out, and then you won't have you'll shift this to the marketplace where you don't have this political / monopoly. Spectrum warehouse owner, making choices for how much spectrum gets out to the market. based upon political considerations. And that will smooth out, and you'll move to contract and competition rather than the, these issues that you bring up.
I think we've run out of